It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, the former Shadow Home Secretary and Labour MP Diane Abbott, former Conservative Culture Minister Ed Vaizey, the I paper's policy editor Jane Merrick and Conservative commentator Tim Montgomerie. Today, have government ministers stoked the fire of racist abuse directed at England's footballers?
The Home Secretary is committed to tackling racism. She is taking action as Home Secretary to tackle extremist groups. That is what she is doing.
Sort your own house out first, and then you can start to talk about other people, talk about other organisations.
The government confirms COVID legal restrictions will end on July the 19th, but for how long?
Don't be demob happy about this. This is not the end of COVID.
We'll also ask if the government is doing enough to protect the clinically extremely vulnerable. Also today, wildfires rage in the western United States as temperatures soar. Is more radical climate action needed?
Letting climate change just continue to get worse and worse and worse is really no option. It costs lives, it costs livelihoods, but it's also economically extremely costly.
More on that later, but let's start with the front page of the Metro, which says England star slams Patel. That's Tyrone Mings, and slamming Priti Patel here for what she had said about taking the knee being gesture politics. Let's have a look at what he tweeted very directly. You don't get to stoke the fire at the beginning of the tournament by labelling our anti-racism message as gesture politics and then pretend to be disgusted when the very thing we're campaigning against happens. You can see that's a direct response to Priti Patel talking about England players. My question to open the programme to all of you is, have government ministers stoked the fire of racism, to use Tyrone Mings' words, against England's footballers? Ed Vaizey.
No, I don't. I mean, I obviously supported taking the knee enthusiastically. I think it's fantastic that our football players were politically engaged, and I think taking the knee was a completely inoffensive way of raising the very real problem we have of racism in football. So I would much rather the government had supported taking the knee, just as they've supported Kick It Out, the Kick It Out campaign, which is designed to drive out racism in football. And I think that the footballers have shown great courage in taking the knee and taking a stand on this issue. And I think what we've seen after the European Cup final is there is a very real problem here and it needs to be tackled.
Right, but what about Priti Patel's words saying that taking the knee can be seen as a political gesture? Her words, has she stoked the fires of racism?
Well, I think the government slightly tied itself up in knots here, and it's partly to do with slightly ambivalent attitude to the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I think BLM is very important. I think that tackling institutional racism and racism in our society is very important. There have been concerns that some people involved in that agenda might have other issues. We saw it in the US as well with potentially attacks on the police. And this is the problem. And this is why I think the government tied itself up in knots on this issue. I think they would have been much better off simply saying it's completely appropriate for footballers to take the knee, to show support for their colleagues and to show that they are opposed to racism in football, as we all are, as indeed is the government.
All right, Diane?
Priti Patel, at the beginning of the contest, refused to condemn people who were booing English sportsmen. I've never known, over 30 years in Parliament, I've never known a British minister refuse to condemn people booing British sportsmen. And I don't think there's any question that by refusing to do it, she helped create the conditions. And we've seen some of the awful racism online, on Twitter, the awful graffiti on the mural of Marcus Rashford.
How did she help Priti Patel, though, create the atmosphere, as you say, or lay the foundations for that sort of racism and the tweets that we've seen after the final?
Because, as I say, it has always been unheard of for a British minister to condone people booing British sportsmen, and that was part of giving legitimacy to that. She had the opportunity to condemn it, and she wouldn't.
Tim?
Well, I was a season ticket holder at Old Trafford for nearly a decade, and I remember the kick-out racism campaigns that were regularly sort of spotlighted during those matches. And I can't remember anyone at all objecting to those campaigns. And the unfortunate thing, and Ed Vaizey just sort of touched on it, is that the Black Lives Matter movement and the taking of the knee are connected. And unfortunately, for many of us, the Black Lives Matter movement is not a unifying thing. We're all against racism, but the Black Lives Matter movement takes positions on capitalism, against the police, against the traditional family that many of us object to. And I think the people at the head of the FA in particular would have been wiser to have found something like the Kick Out Racism campaign that unified us, because the battle against racism is far too important to be as divisive as it's become.
Right, well, Diane, you're shaking your head. Before I come to you, Jane, do you want to respond?
It's really sad that Tories want to politicise people taking a stand on racism. The young footballers who took the knee at the beginning of their matches, they're not party political in the way that Tim is implying. They wanted to show they were taking a position against racism. That was all, very simple. And because they're younger as well, it's important for them to support their colleagues and to take a stand.
Tim?
Well, that's why, my remarks, Diane, were directed very much towards the football authorities. I think they could have seen this coming, because the Black Lives Matter movement is divisive. That's a fact. And we could have found another gesture, a way of applauding for a minute for a kick-out racism message. There were plenty of ways that this could have been done without causing division. I don't blame the young players at all. I blame the football authorities for not seeing this coming, because it was obvious very early on. And I'm afraid I blame people like you, Diane, a bit too as well. You're too eager to see racism from Tories when there isn't racism. There is just a very legitimate concern about the Black Lives Matter movement, which has extreme views.
Are you saying that racist graffiti on the Marcus Rashford, the Marcus Rashford picture in Manchester, that wasn't racist? What are you saying?
Of course it's racist.
Is it not racist? Are you saying it's not racist the way people were on Twitter and online talking about niggers and how niggers lost it?
Well, hang on, let's not use that word.
Well,
on
exactly.
broadcast.
But don't tell me that's not racist.
And I haven't begun to say that. I hate racism. As far as I'm concerned, every person born is born in the image of God. We have all absolute equal worth and significance. What you are doing, though, you're trying to collide the whole issue of that awful graffiti on Marcus Rashford's mural and the terrible things that are said on social media with things that Priti Patel has said about a very extreme political movement. And that's very bad, Diane, because you are a source of disunity rather than unity on a question where we should be united against the very real racism that English players face.
Before we move on, I'd just like to apologise to viewers for the use of that word, Diane, so we won't repeat it. I know you were just describing some of the racist tweets that were published after the match on Sunday night. Jane, is it possible to be, as Priti Patel says, against racism and anti-racist, but still see taking the knee as a political gesture and a separate issue, or not?
Well, I have to say I can see why Diane is so angry, actually, and to be accused of causing disunity on this subject, I think, is not fair. She's a campaigner against racism. She's subject to the most horrific racist abuse online. And I think, actually, what Boris Johnson and Priti Patel did is they set the context, as Diane said, for the whole tournament. Our political leaders, just as our sporting leaders, always set a context. And Gareth Southgate did that by saying that politics is part of football, and footballers have to take a position on these things. Boris Johnson, by failing to condemn that booing, did give a licence to this kind of behaviour. There isn't a sort of one follows the other, but there was a condition there that was created, and I think they are right to now back down from that and to sound a bit more contrite about it.
Well, I will come back to you in a moment. Diane, Tim, you're shaking your head.
Look, Priti Patel in particular is someone who's experienced terrible racism in her life. Boris Johnson has put together probably, well, definitely the most diverse cabinet in British history. The idea that this government isn't committed to the kind of racially equal Britain that we all grown-ups want to see is nonsense. And I think when people rush to turn up the temperature on these race issues rather than turn them down, which I do accuse large sections of the Labour Party of doing, they aren't helping the cause. And I'm afraid we've seen an example of that in the last few minutes.
Right, but let me just show all of you this tweet from Johnny Mercer, Conservative MP. The painful truth is that this guy, Tyrone Mings, is completely right. Very uncomfortable with the position we Conservatives are needlessly forcing ourselves into. Do I fight it or stay silent? Modern conservatism was always so much more to me. We must not lose our way. Ed?
Well, look, I think that I wouldn't accuse Priti Patel of creating the climate or causing what happened. I think there would have been racist incidents come what way, because we have a problem of racism in football and we have a problem of racism in our society. But I think it was bad politics not to support taking the knee. I think it's a very complicated and silly argument to sort of try and unpack the Black Lives Matters movement. It was of its time. It was taken from the US where it took off. And of course, Tim is right that there are complicated issues in there and there are different agendas which Conservatives and indeed main people in mainstream society wouldn't support. But the fact that, as it were, people who are opposed to the government are now able to run an argument that the government is somehow responsible for these racist incidents, I think shows that it was silly. And I don't think, you know, I've gone on the record many times about this. I don't think we should be engaging in this kind of silly culture war. It seems to me perfectly obvious that if young English football players want to take the knee to show their support for their colleagues and to show their opposition to racism, something we all support, it's perfectly appropriate to say that that is a magnanimous and important gesture that we support as well. I don't see what mileage you get by not supporting that or attacking it. It gets you absolutely nowhere, and as we've seen, gets you actually into quite a bit of trouble.
I mean, Diane, does it matter, really, what politicians say? I mean, the people who are responsible for this atrocious abuse are racist.
I agree with you that sometimes it doesn't really matter what we say. We're only listening to ourselves. But in this instance, with a very senior member of government refusing to condemn people booing English sportsmen, that did matter, and it did make an impact. And for Tim to say, oh, I'm a source of disunity, well, you know, I've had literally more abuse online and on Twitter than any other woman MP. And the idea that I am the cause of that and I am a source of disunity, that's where people are going so wrong on this. That people like Tim have to understand that younger people take anti-racism very seriously and want to support their colleagues. And the kind of line that Priti Patel was putting out at the beginning of the contest doesn't land well with them.
We've got some breaking news to bring to you in this tweet from Dominic Casciani, BBC Home Affairs correspondent, breaking Colin Pitchfork to leave prison after a ruling that the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, has no grounds to challenge the parole board's experts who concluded the 1980s double child killer was safe to be released after 33 years in jail. So they have rejected that intervention or attempt at an intervention from the Justice Secretary. Ed Vaizey, what's your response?
Well, look, I'd much rather he stayed in prison for the rest of his life, and he's sentenced the families of those two poor girls to life sentences by this appalling, brutal act. But I also do accept that there is an independent process. And although politicians can frame the criminal justice system and the sentencing system we have, I'm afraid it cannot be a political decision. It does have to be independent. We saw with the case of John Moorboys that it is possible to push back on these decisions. The parole board don't always get it right. I think it's extremely unfortunate. But if you ask me, as it were, to make a choice, I would prefer to have an independent system than one that politicians drove in each individual case.
Diane, you were Shadow Home Secretary. What's your reaction to this news? It's
not for politicians to challenge the parole board, who've got the information, who've had all the data in front of them. Clearly, as a mother, you are unhappy that he's coming out like this, but I think it's wrong for politicians.
Why should they never challenge it?
I think it's important to have an independent process which is free from political interference. Political interference, although it may work well in the tabloid press, political interference is never the right thing.
Right, so in all circumstances, you don't think government ministers should intervene in the way Robert Buckland has done?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a way of appealing to a certain section of the electorate. It's not right for politicians to interfere in these processes.
I have no problem with Robert Buckland interfering. I just think it's right that it's an independent process that makes the final decision. I have no problem with the Justice Secretary making a submission to the parole board that this person should be kept in prison.
All right, let's leave it there. Turn to coronavirus, because the UK government, as you will know, has confirmed that most coronavirus restrictions in England will be lifted in just 6 days' time on Monday, the 19th of July. But Boris Johnson yesterday issued this warning.
Because the legal restrictions have come off, should not be taken as an invitation by everybody simply to have a great jubilee and freedom from any kind of caution or restraint.
And the government's announcement came alongside some modelling, which the Times have on their front page, showing it to our viewers now. Thousands in hospital each day if UK is hasty. And they also report that according to the same modelling, we could see up to 200 deaths a day unless the public takes a cautious approach to reopening. Jane, are we to some extent flying blind because we don't know how the public are going to respond? There was a sense of Boris Johnson saying you will get your freedoms back, but please don't use them.
I think that flying blind is a really good quote, actually. Lord Bethell, the health minister, said in the Lords last week that we are, to a certain extent, walking into the unknown after July the 19th. I think it's very difficult. I'm not sure what politicians and scientists can do, because if we don't have the peak in August, it risks pushing the peak into the autumn, into the winter, and that would be worse. So it's a very difficult moment. I think the public actually will be cautious. There won't be a big bang and a jubilee, as the Prime Minister warned against yesterday. I think the modelling, which talks about 4,800 hospital admissions a day, that is based on people is based on people rushing back and throwing off their face masks and doing all the sort of pre-pandemic behaviour. Actually, what a study by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has shown, that people are still limiting their contacts. They're not speaking and meeting to as many people as they did before the pandemic, and that's even since the May unlocking of all that sort of aspects of hospitality and pubs and so on. So I think the public will be cautious. I think a lot of people will carry on wearing face masks. They will meet fewer people. It will take some time, I think, to get back to normal, and that's obviously good for hospital admissions.
Do you agree, Tim?
Well, I think the average death rate in the UK now is lower than the normal. If we aren't going to liberate people from the restrictions now, I don't think we ever will. There's obviously going to be a possibility in the winter months, when we are more vulnerable, that there will be more potential for some restrictions, mandatory restrictions, to be reintroduced. But for the moment, I think the government's position is just about right. I worry about not having compulsory mask wearing on public transport, because I think particularly vulnerable people can choose not to go to restaurants or other places, for example, but they often can't choose not to use public transport. They have to use that to see family, to get to work, etc. So that's the one area of government policy I'm a little bit worried about. But generally, I think they're moving in the right direction at the right speed.
Diane, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has called the government's approach reckless. But what's the alternative?
The problem with the government's approach is the lack of clarity. And a lot of people, whether it's a restaurant or you're running Transport for Labour or whatever, people won't be quite sure what is meant to happen. And I think what is Boris's problem is he's torn between Tories who are into this thing about the 19th being Freedom Day and the rest of it, and what the actual scientific and medical evidence says. And so the lack of clarity is very disturbing, particularly for vulnerable people.
Yes, and we're going to talk about vulnerable people in just a moment. But on the sort of speed of unlocking, Ed, I mean, the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, stressed repeatedly yesterday, not just caution, but that England needed to go slowly and steadily. Is that what they're doing with the 19th of July?
No, I think they're taking, and there's an element of risk. I very much support what they're doing. I I do regard July the 19th as Freedom Day, to paraphrase Diane. As a typical Tory, I regard it as Freedom Day, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I really hope the government holds its nerve. I saw that the Netherlands have reimposed restrictions, and I think the trouble with this entire debate, given that we've all, a lot of people have got the vaccine, is we seem to have moved from the original position, which was to protect the NHS, which means reducing deaths and hospitalisations, to trying to sort of eradicate the virus. And I very much support the tone that Sajid Javid has, which is we have to learn to live with the virus. And the key will be, if we continue to publish the rates of infection, it will give a completely misleading picture. We need to focus on hospitalisations and obviously deaths. And if those rise to unacceptable levels because of this, then we may, I'm afraid, face a further lockdown. But at the moment, I think the government is right, because what the hell was the point of vaccinating the majority of the population for the last 6 months, which has been a highly successful process. So I'm very much behind them on this.
Right. Well, Diane mentioned clinically vulnerable people. Jane, on the front page of the Eye, 3.8 million vulnerable told avoid people who haven't had both jabs. What are you talking about here?
Yeah, this is really, it's causing a lot of anger, and 3.8 million people is obviously a significant amount who are classed as clinically extremely vulnerable, 5% of the population. And during lockdown, they were advised to shield, and that was very clear. The shielding advice ended, along with extra support from the government in terms of working from home and benefits, on the 21st of June. And now they've had this new guidance issued saying that they should avoid people who've been unvaccinated, try to avoid mixing indoors. This is a significant amount of people who are basically effectively being told to shield, but aren't getting the backup from the government in terms of their employer allowing them to work from home. They're going to have to rely on the good graces of their employer and hope that they have a very understanding boss to be able to carry on working from home. And also, I think, as one clinically extremely vulnerable person told me, what are they supposed to do when they go into a shop? Are they supposed to know who's been vaccinated and who's not? It's very, very difficult for them, I think, and very worrying. And I think while so many people might describe this as Freedom Day, I'm certainly not describing it as that. For them, it's going to be a backward step in terms of freedom, because they'll be much more fearful, especially about face masks and travelling. And I think Tim is right to say that doing things that they have to do, like travelling on public transport, there is going to be that fear there that people aren't wearing masks. Right,
well, not Freedom Day then for that group, Ed. I'm just going to show our viewers this tweet from the Liberal Democrat Sal Brinton. Clinically extremely vulnerable guidance finally up on government website, confirms earlier briefing. Don't mix with unvaccinated. Meet outside. Don't go into work if possible. This isn't guidance. It's ministers abdicating responsibility for the 3.8 million clinically extremely vulnerable 5% of population. Ed?
Well, I think that's sort of slightly silly political point scoring. The clinically vulnerable people that I know do take personal responsibility for their own safety. They recognise that they are more at risk than those of us who are not clinically vulnerable, and they've already factored into their lives many of the things that they need to do. It is very unfortunate for them. But
how will they know? How will they know who's been double vaccinated?
People make arrangements to ensure, even if people who are self-isolating make arrangements with their friends and family for the support that they need. And the clinically vulnerable people that I know have made those arrangements. They are living through a pandemic. But as I say, I think it is important, now that the majority of the population is vaccinated, that we can move towards some sort of normality. And I think people will take responsibility, given their own particular health circumstances, to lead their lives as safely as they want to. And I think that is not something the government cannot legislate for every dot and comma. We know from the guidance that we've had from the government over the last 18 months, some of it has been absurd and contradictory. 60,000 people went to Wembley Stadium on Sunday, while weddings and so on were still restricted. So a lot of it is contradictory. And at the end of the day, all of us, even those who aren't clinically vulnerable, have taken personal responsibility and a sensible approach to what we are willing to risk and what we're not willing to risk.
Diane?
As I said earlier, the lack of clarity is very disturbing. And if you're clinically vulnerable, Tim is saying that, most people have been vaccinated. It's not as simple as that. There are parts of the country and parts of London where very many people have not had their second vaccination. I think you're putting people at risk, and also the government is stepping away from its responsibility to the most vulnerable people.
Right, so would you not be lifting the restrictions on the 19th of July then?
I wouldn't be calling it Freedom Day. I think we need a lot more clarity.
Right, OK, Ed?
Well, on this basis, this is never going to end then, if we're not allowed to move forward.
Do you accept that, Diane, that if not now, as have been put, when would Labour do it?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure that people have had their 2 vaccinations, and that people that run shops or restaurants, employers and so on, are very clear about what they should do and not do. This lack of clarity might suit some people, but it's putting people at risk.
All right, I'm just going to draw your attention, Tim, to respond to the Daily Telegraph headline. Boris Johnson urges use of COVID vaccine passports. The Prime Minister says venues with large crowds will be asked to adopt certification as a matter of social responsibility. Is he right to encourage venues to do this, Tim?
I think it's probably the right balance, actually, this. I think people are very nervous about the government mandating use of these passports. But if an independent institution wants to reassure its customers and its staff that by introducing something like this, I think that's a sensible middle way.
Jane?
I would agree with that, actually. I mean, I think it's one of those things where you don't want to mandate something like COVID passports. I think there are concerns about that in terms of sort of a creep of incursion into civil liberty. So yes, if private or independent organisations want to do that to reassure, if there's a choice to go to an art gallery, they want to reassure the people visiting that they've got that in place, I think that's fine. I don't think that cuts across anything about the concerns of vulnerable people.
Let's talk about climate change and show our viewers and guests these pictures of wildfires that are breaking out in western parts of the United States. This is following extreme heat waves in parts of America and also Canada, recording their highest ever temperatures. And these wildfires have followed several weeks of those temperatures. Dozens of people have died. You can see there the mercury hitting 56 degrees, a record high in terms of heat. A group of researchers have studied how global warming has affected the occurrence of these types of climate events. Now, earlier we spoke to Dr. Frederica Otto, Associate Director at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. She's co-authored a report looking at the recent heat waves in North America.
We have identified what kind of event it is in the world we live in today, and found that even with climate change we have today, it is still a very rare event, expected to happen about once in 1,000 years. And then we have asked the question, and how would this event be different in a world that is the same as ours, but without the human-caused greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? And we can model this world using climate models, because we know very well how many greenhouse gases have been emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And we found that in this world that would have been without climate change, this event would have been almost impossible to occur. And we've also looked in how would this event change in a future world if we had already 2 degrees of global warming. And we found that in that world, an event like this would occur every 5 to 10 years in that part of the world.
OK, well, that was Dr. Frederica Otto. Let's welcome Amelia Womack from the Green Party. Amelia, hello to you. We just heard Dr. Otto saying that actually if there's warming of 2 degrees, then we could go from once in 1,000-year event, like the ones that we've seen in parts of America and Canada, to once every 5 to 10 years. The government set ambitious targets to get to net zero by 2050. So what more specifically can the government do here to stop events like the ones we're seeing in another part of the world happening more often?
So the government can do far more to tackle the climate crisis. And if we look at what's happening, it's not just about wildfires in America. We've got flooding at the doorsteps of our communities here in the UK, as well as growing droughts around the world. I can't help but reflect on the fact that I learned about this in textbooks when I was at school, and now it's on our news channels on a daily basis. we need to be making sure that our government doesn't just have warm words. The government's own 10-point plan falls short when it comes to climate, with only getting halfway there when it comes to emissions. And that's just the parts that they've actually got policies on. There are glaring gaps in every single aspect of it, as well as that lack of ambition. We have seen things like the green grants for homes to be essentially not invested in and basically put on the back burner and disappearing off the scene.
All right.
That lack of ambition is pulling us behind in meeting any kind of target, and the risks are getting greater.
Ed, is there a gap between the rhetoric and the ambition and the policy?
No, I don't think there is. The UK has been a world leader in combating climate change, and we've reduced emissions more than most other countries. And actually, we've reduced it with much less economic impact than other comparable countries like Germany. But I think where climate change, the political aspect of climate change is that, yes, this government needs to continue to lead into it. I mean, there was this very funny article in the Telegraph yesterday by a Conservative commentator almost apologising for accepting that action needed to be taken on climate change. And going back to the discussion we had about Black Lives Matter, sort of saying the right has to own this agenda so the lefty wokies don't adopt it themselves. But the point is there is a Conservative agenda on climate change. Not only are we party of the environment, but actually there's an economic interest in being ahead of with the kind of technologies that the world is going to need to combat climate change. It is the most important issue facing the human race, and the UK and a Conservative government can take the lead on it. We've got a great record on it, as has the previous Labour government, and we should continue to build on it.
Do you agree with that, Amelia? According to the Committee on Climate Change, the UK has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions faster than any other G20 economy over the period from 2008 to 2018.
I'd want to highlight the fact that the Stern Review nearly 15 years ago said about the economic impact. Effectively, if we start to take action then, it would be a lot cheaper than doing it in the future. And now here we are in the future and we haven't even got that far. By looking at our own emissions here in the UK, we don't take into account the fact that we're a global, we work around the world, that lots of our items that we're purchasing, lots of our electronics are coming from other countries. Even our clothing are creating a huge carbon impact, a huge environmental impact, and those emissions aren't counted in terms of what we're doing in the UK. It's a much bigger issue than just being able to say that we've reduced our emissions here, which we have not done close enough.
All right.
But also we've seen investment into road building, into fracking, into building new coal mines. It's essentially, again, those warm words, and we're seeing actions that don't meet those climate targets.
Tim, how do you bring people along with you? Conservative MP Steve Baker has warned that banning new gas boilers from mid-2020s for new builds and 2035 in older houses will lead to riots on the streets.
I heard him say that on your programme recently as well, Joe. Look, we have to be intelligent about how we tackle this very real problem. The pictures and the stories from Canada are horrendous, are frightening. And that's, of course, a developed world country. How climate change will affect the poorest people of the world will be even greater. But a lot of what we've done in terms of meeting our emissions targets at the moment has, as I think Amelia, if I've got the name right, has just said, and was exporting industrial capacity to other parts of the world that actually produce the things that we then import back in dirtier ways than if they'd stayed in an environment of British regulation. And I think when history of our period in time is written, there'll be two great issues. One will be how we respond to climate change. The other will be how we respond to the rise of China. China is an authoritarian state that is persecuting Uyghurs, and if it gets the opportunity, will do worse things. And they are building coal-fired power stations still at an astonishing rate. So what we need to do in the West is we certainly need to tackle climate change.
Yes.
But if we give further economic advantage to China at the same time, we are not really solving the climate change problem, and we are increasing the power of a communist totalitarian state. So we need our heads switched on as well as our hearts.
Do you agree with that, Amelia, when it comes to China?
I feel like that's a curveball on this issue. When we look at countries around the world, we know that China is aware of climate change because it will be feeling the force of it. But we also know that we need to be making sure that we are working with countries to make sure we reduce our carbon emissions. Just talking about China just kind of takes away from what we can do here in the UK. And I think that essentially, yes, the coal power plants are dirtier, but there is still investment into other parts of green energy and other green infrastructure. What we're seeing at the moment is that we're reaching tipping points, effectively a point of no return, where things like wildfires are going to release carbon into the atmosphere that is going to take us further into those global emissions. We're looking at the moment, we're looking at 1.2 degrees of warming. What does 1.4, 1.5 or even 2 degrees look like? Paris is 3 to 4 degrees. These are the reality that we have now, and we need to be working internationally and collaboratively on how we do that.
Okay.
And policy here in the UK can change that by making the greenest option, the cheapest and easiest option, and making sure that in the Environment Bill, we don't have trade deals that undermine our carbon targets.
Right. I mean, I've read earlier the quotes from the Committee on Climate Change about the progress that the UK has made. Do you accept that the UK has done a pretty good job up until now in terms of reducing emissions and taking the requisite policy action?
We all have to own this agenda. There was a mention just now that the Conservatives should own this agenda. We all have to own this agenda. And we have done quite well in reducing emissions, but there is a lot more to do. It's about the future, and it's about the future, actually, of young people. And so I think politicians of all parties have to be quite brave in taking the steps that will reduce emissions further.
Do you think Keir Starmer needs to be braver? Does he need to do more, speak more about this issue?
Well, I mean, currently there's a lot going on, but my understanding from my colleagues is that we want to take a very forward-thinking line on climate change, and you will hear that from Keir in due course.
Right. I mean, Jane, do you think people are ready for the sorts of actions that Amelia is outlining in terms of hitting the targets that have been set?
Yeah, I think they need to be. I mean, actually, I've been reporting on British politics for 20 years, and I've just can remember sort of ministers back then talking about climate change as a future problem. And as Amelia says, it's here now. You know, the flooding in central London last night, just very, very extreme events that we're going to see more regularly. I think tomorrow the Transport Secretary is going to outline a decarbonisation strategy, which will put a lot of focus on roads and how much emissions come from roads. I think it's something like 70 to 80% of transport emissions. We just need to be more aware of actually that I think in 2050 we will look back at the slowness of introducing things like electric vehicles, the slowness of phasing out petrol and diesel by 2030 and wondering why the government didn't do that sooner. I think all of those things we need to be ready because it needs to happen much more quickly than in sort of 10 years' time.
All right, final thought from Amelia before we let you go.
When we started to lock down for COVID, people were looking at big ideas because they realised the kind of society that we had before caused many of these problems. And I think people are ready for that big change that makes sure that we do reduce our risk of issues like climate change. And this is a moment in time where we can ensure that we do, I mean, it's cliche, but we do build back better because we know we can create something better with a Green New Deal and genuine policies being put in place.
Amelia Womack, thank you. We're going to talk about overseas aid because MPs are due to vote on the government's cut to the UK's foreign aid budget. Ministers want to introduce a new test now that would tie overseas aid spending to the levels of government borrowing and debt. But there are many potential rebels, particularly on the Conservative side. Let's talk to Helen Catt, the BBC's political correspondent. How come this is going to a vote, Helen?
Well, the government had been pretty reluctant to put it to a vote. It was announced last November, and of course the cut has already taken effect for this year. It took effect in January. But there have been many attempts by backbench MPs to try and get a vote on this in the Commons, and I think it had just started to look pretty inevitable that at some point one would make it to the floor. So working on the basis that governments don't tend to offer votes that they don't think they can win, presumably it thinks that this compromise, as it sees it, that it's offering will bring enough of its own backbenchers back on side to get this through. There are, of course, though, a number of rebels we know, and it does look like it could be tight.
Right. In terms of what Rishi Sunak and the Treasury have stated in their written ministerial statement on this, there was an implication that actually if they don't claw back money from the overseas aid budget, then it may have to come from other areas.
Well, That's certainly how the Treasury seems to be trying to frame this, that this is about fiscal responsibility. It points to the huge amount of debt that's been run up over the last year, £300 billion nearly, and that's the biggest debt since the Second World War. So it points to that large amount of spending and has said this is a temporary and necessary cut. On the other hand, you've got critics of it saying, well, it's all very well to balance the books, but not to do that on the backs of the world's poorest. And this is a global pandemic. It's not just the UK that's been affected. So that's what's at the heart of this. The idea, the worry from some critics is that what this will do, if the government manages to get this motion through today, is to bake in this cut for the long term. It's worth that difference, that 0.2% difference, is worth about £4 billion a year. Okay. So if this passes today, they worry that what you'll be looking at then is not just a cut of £4 billion this year, but next year and the year after, until these tests are met, and they're quite hard tests to meet. Okay. The Treasury's argument is that, look, this is a fair compromise that we have to do.
Helen Catt, thank you. Tim, your response.
Well, as Helen Catt has just sort of suggested, this isn't a compromise of any real kind from the Treasury, unfortunately. The estimate is that some of the Conservative MPs fighting for the aid budget is that actually, if you looked over the last 20 years, there would just be one of those 20 years which would then qualify for us spending 0.7%. So this is a way, I'm afraid, of the government baking in their abandonment of that 0.7% target that was in the Tory manifesto, that was in all of the party manifestos. And I think even if you don't support the 0.7% aid budget, there's something un-British, un-conservative about the way that this cut has been enacted. There are projects all over the world that were sort of in the middle of their operation, programs to tackle poverty, programs to provide health, and they've been abandoned in the middle of those projects, abandoning the vulnerable people that depended upon. Well, and that is the really offensive part of this.
Un-British and un-conservative, Ed?
Well, I can't see how that's British. I don't think there's a conservative or other way of doing this. I mean, I totally support the government on this. I think the 0.7% figure is completely arbitrary. I think a lot of the money is wasted. I think the old DFID used to run around looking for projects to fund because it had to spend this gargantuan amount of money, while other ministers, including me, were at the begging bowl at the Treasury with our begging bowls asking for more. So I think the government's absolutely right about this, and I hope we have a much more intelligent and sensible aid policy going forward. And I think bringing it back under the auspices of the Foreign Office is the right thing to do. And I think we can be very effective with less money, a much more thoughtful approach.
Diane?
It's very sad that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, wants to balance his books on the backs of literally the poorest people in the world. This country, under actually both the Labour and Conservative governments, some Conservative governments, has a great record when it comes to development and aid. And it is sad that Boris and his Chancellor want to jettison that history and that record.
Jane, will they win, the government?
I'm not sure they will. I mean, I know that I can sort of see that they're trying to pull all the stops out with this offer. But as Andrew Mitchell said, I think this morning, that this borrowing test is a trap. As Tim was saying, it's to meet that condition, it would only happen once in 20 years. And I think there is a lot of anger across the House, but on the Tory benches on this. That David Cameron, under his leadership, created this sort of progressive conservatism that was defending foreign aid.
All right, well, I'm sorry to cut you off there, Jane, but thank you to you and all of my guests, and I will be back tomorrow at 11:15 with Prime Minister's Questions. Please join me then.